Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the M.Y.T.E Podcast. M.Y.T.E, as you're aware, stands for Manage Your Thoughts and Emotions, and that's what we empower children and teens to do. Today, we have Lucinda Powell joining us. Lucinda joins us from Changing States of Mind. And yeah, Lucinda's a mum. She has three boys. She's a teacher. She's been in the educational sector for the last 20 years. She has a degree in philosophy, psychology, and is a Master of Arts degree as well in
Special and inclusive education.
inclusive education. She runs her own weekly podcast called Psychology in the Classroom. And Lucinda is all about helping teachers and parents get teenagers through education, applying evidence-based psychology to everyday learning. So this sort of underpins everything that M.Y.T.E is about with regards to emotional well-being, with regards to mental well-being, and just helping children and their parents and their teachers navigate that whole area. So thank you so much for being here, Lucinda.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful. So can you just tell us a little bit about you and how you got into doing what it is that you do today?
Gosh, so yeah, as you said, I've been in education for over 20 years now, which makes me feel very old. And originally, I just always wanted to be a teacher. And then I realized that over time, I had a degree in psychology, I had all this knowledge, and how could I apply this kind of theoretical stuff, not just to teaching it, but also to apply it to my practice. And I think so this is really going to age me, because when I started teaching, we didn't have to do safeguarding. So there was no safeguarding practices at all.
Okay.
And I remember as a young, very naive teacher coming in thinking, well, I'm a psychology teacher. What happens if they ask me about, I don't know, they tell me they're anorexic, and because I'm a psychology teacher, I should know about anorexia. And I knew nothing about anorexia because it was not something I'd studied. I'd studied lots of other things, but not anorexia. And, nowadays you know exactly what to do. You go to a safeguarding leader, someone discloses. There was nothing like that. And so that really sort of sat uncomfortably with me. And so I guess over time, just from personal experiences, I kind of worried about mental health and noticed that changing over time as well. We did, as psychology teachers, get, students who particularly have problems with their mental health, because it is one of the reasons why they choose psychology. They want to know about themselves and learn about themselves. And then I had a child who was diagnosed relatively young with high functioning autism. It was called Asperger's. I mean, people will know it as Asperger's as well. And then ADHD. And so that sort of drove my interests down the kind of special educational needs route. But I'm also really interested in study skills and how we learn. And I don't think any of these things are inseparable. So whilst, how well you study, how easy you find it to study is linked with your mental health, and equally your mental health is linked to how well and how easy and you can find it to learn. And then there's obviously the special educational needs and the neurodiversity, which is again kind of exploded in the last 20 years, because certainly when I came into teaching, I knew what autism was vaguely. I knew what dyslexia was, but I didn't really know very much about it. I covered it sort of probably in my first year of my degree or something. And again, lots of teachers didn't have a clue what any of these things were. So really, that's how I ended up applying the psychology that I've covered. And I always call myself a kind of a psychological jack of all trades and master of none, because I don't sit anyway. I just kind of generally go, oh, well, that's an interesting bit of psychology and it applies to education in this way. So there we go. That's kind of a summary.
Wowzers. So what is it that you actually do to support teachers and parents, and how do you do it?
Well, no, so I'm a teacher myself, and I work in school 4 days a week. So predominantly, that's what I'm doing.
Okay. And what are you teaching in schools?
I teach psychology. So I still teach psychology.
Okay,
but
so
I'm always
senior schools in a
So I teach mainly A level. And then I also, as part of my role, I'm really privileged to help. I have a peculiar title, which is Assistant Director of Teaching and Learning, and I get to go and work with my colleagues to help and support them in developing their own teaching practice. So that will cover a lot of things. That covers a lot of inset. We're doing all sorts of exciting things. So that's kind of in my day-to-day job. And then within that, I also they have the one day when I'm working from home. It's not my day off. Very much work from home, and in that day, I do a lot of work with. I do some work with trainee teachers. I go and do training in schools. So I'll go into schools and I can put together bespoke training packages. So, for example, I've just done one on helping teachers around encouraging their students to be more independent in their learning. And then I do the podcast, which for me is kind of the main thing. You said weekly at the beginning, and then this term actually I've stepped back a little bit because I literally can't do a weekly podcast. So far I've released one, but I've got 3 recorded that I need to edit up and put out. So they'll be coming very soon. So again, for me, that's the kind of, I suppose, the most fundamental thing. It basically takes the up-to-date research, which I'm really privileged to have access to, and I have an amazing network of psychologists who are researching in this area. And I talk to them and what they're doing, and I take papers and I try and translate them a little bit so that teachers can access that free of charge. And I suppose in that there's a lot of stuff for parents as well. So, for example, when I do the interviews in the podcast, I'm talking specifically to teachers. I do also it will resonate with parents, and it's really interesting. I've just actually interviewed a really amazing pair of psychologists this morning, talking about autism and ADHD, and they are creating a new questionnaire to look at what they've kind of created this new concept of emotional burden. So they're moving from this idea of an internal emotional dysregulation model to actually looking at how does the environment impact young people with ADHD and autism, and what is it that teachers and schools can do to kind of reduce that, and how does their response to incidents in school differ from perhaps neurotypical children. So that's a really kind of interesting. It was so fascinating. It was absolutely amazing.
God, I bet you've spoken to and including your own wealth of knowledge. So I was reading up on your website, and you were talking about somewhere on the site. You were talking about neuromyth.
Yes,
so I'm going there and I'm googling about neuromyth and trying to understand that, and I've understood that as a commonly held false belief about how the mind and brain functions. So this is something that obviously you're aware of and you understand, but for someone like myself who doesn't, and any parents that are listening, how can this impact our children, and what can we do to support our children with, sort of, you talk about evidence-based psychology and everyday learning. What does that look like, and what can we do to support our children within that?
Oh, okay. So in terms of parents, I suppose neuromyths are things that come up through just misunderstanding or some kind of, so a really typical one is learning styles. And so a lot of parents are probably of the age where learning styles were a thing in school. So they were told they were a kinesthetic learner or a visual learner. And the problem is that we definitely have learning preferences. We like to learn visually, or we like to learn by doing things. And that's a preference. The problem is that when you're trying to learn facts, you can't learn that by doing things. Sometimes you just have to read. You just have to, or you have to listen. You have to learn it. It can only come across. It's a bit like you can't learn to ride a bicycle without actually getting on a bicycle and riding it. So as a visual learner, you're never going to learn to ride a bicycle. It's just a complete load of rubbish, basically. And so intuitively it makes sense, and there's a lot of psychology that intuitively makes sense, but then when you do the research, it doesn't bear out. And that's a really good one. Another really typical one is we only use 10% of our brain, which again is like, it's a hugely energy uses a huge amount of energy. So why would we only use 10%? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But I suppose if we're thinking about kind of myths or things that intuitively feel right, but actually when we do the evidence is wrong, and ways that we might think about helping and supporting our young people through school. A really typical one is something called the illusion of fluency, which I love, and I love educating people about. So if I get the opportunity, and this is the idea that what students will do to learn is they will tend to read and reread their notes.
Yes.
So if you say, I read and reread my notes, and you get to the end of it and you've read them 3 or 4 times, and you ask them, you say, like, how well do you think you're going to remember this? Like, yeah, I really know it. I'm going to like fly. And the next day in the test that they do, because they've like crammed it all in the night before and they've read it, they do really, really well. But you also say to them, okay, in a week's time, how well are you going to do? Oh, like, I won't forget anything. And we have this thing about like we forget how much we forget. It's almost like forgetting isn't a thing.
Yes.
And so a week later, they'll do a test, and the kids that read and reread the stuff will do really badly on the test. And so if you compare that to a group, so they read the text through, here's your information, read it through once, and then you have to write it out so you maybe write it out 3 or 4 times without looking back at the text. How much can you remember? You write it out. And that retrieval practice, that pulling it back out of your brain, it's really hard work, and they feel like they've learned nothing, and they'll tell you at the end, like, I haven't learned anything. I'm going to, like, in a week's time, I won't remember anything. But actually what's really interesting is a week later, so the next day they won't do as well as the people who've read and read. But a week later, they will have forgotten significantly less, and they will do much better in a test a week later.
Okay.
And it's that retrieval practice, that pulling out the information from our brains, that seems to make it stick more in our heads, which is really interesting. And it is counterintuitive, and that's why it's called the illusion of fluency. It's sometimes also known as the illusion of knowing. And this feeling that we really know it, but actually it is just literally an illusion, and you will forget it much faster. So I think that's
when you're talking about the retrieval, how are you retrieving it? Are you then, because you're reading it and reading it, are you then retrieving it and writing it down?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter how you retrieve it. So you could do it through, you can, like the way they did it in the studies is they basically got them to write as many facts. They had to read a fact-based text, and then they had to write as many facts down from the text as they could remember. And they were scored that way. I think it was about otters or something. And so, but you could do multiple choice quizzes, you could do past paper questions, you can do flashcards. It doesn't really matter as long as you're pulling it out of your brain. And it's almost like the pulling out is the thing that strengthens the literally makes the neurons in your brain grow. Whereas just reading it, and I always say to my students, sadly, what they're not going to do is show you the page of the textbook and go, is this familiar? That's not what they're going to ask you to do. So, in a test, you've got to actually do the thing that you're going to do. Again, you wouldn't go to the Olympics having watched loads of people cycle around a track and then expect to win. You've actually got to get on the bike and do the cycling around the track.
Yes.
So
yes, that makes total sense. So do you see with I know if you've got A-level students, they're 18, that they're
16 to 18,
yeah, 16 to 18. How do you see children of that age struggles, maybe not, but with like emotional regulation, struggling with maybe mental health, and how that then impacts their learning?
Yeah, so I think, the teenage years is, they're just really hard. And we then, amongst that, bung in all of this stress of like, you've got to do your A-levels. And I think that nowadays as well, I don't know why, but the A-levels, they're so pressured. And I think that partly comes from, there's a high, like the society that we live in says you've got to do well in your A-levels. And so there's this pressure externally from them, but there's pressure on us as teachers. So, you get the government saying, well, we've got to get more people to university. So you've got the schools saying, okay, we've got to get higher grades. Well, we've got league tables. So within the school system, there's pressure on, the schools, there's pressure, the school put pressure on the teachers, and the teacher put pressure on the kids. So there's this enormous pressure. And then universities are unbelievably competitive. If you want to go
Yes.
to, a top university, read a popular course, it's incredibly competitive. So these poor young people who are going through all this emotional change, and their brains are like massively restructuring, and there's all sorts of other stuff going on, and then you bung on top these A levels. So it's really hard. And I think as well, life is very different now to how it was certainly when I grew up. I was really privileged. I think I'd love to go back to I mean, in some ways I don't want to go back to the 1980s, but actually the 1980s were great. I cannot imagine my teenage years with a mobile phone. I mean, it just sort of makes me feel a little bit sick. All
It's
things
constant, isn't it?
But also that all of those things, those things you do as a teenager, and you kind of look back and you kind of go, oh, I can't believe I did that. That's so embarrassing.
You've been reminded of it all the time.
Yeah, and quite shaming. Some of this I'm really ashamed of. I'm like, I can't believe I did that. And in the big scheme of things, they're not very important. But I can forget about them. I'm probably the only person in the world who remembers that moment that I said something to somebody. I'm really, really embarrassed about it. But nowadays, like you think, God, that could go onto the internet and it could be there forever. And that's actually really horrible, because it's not that you can't just resign it to the kind of recesses of your memory. It's there on the internet, and if it's out there, you don't know whether you can delete it, and whether it's so. It really makes me sad for the young people, because they have to be, they have to wear a mask at all times. They always have to be watching what they say or watching what they do, and if they don't, actually really, it can end up in really, they can do something really stupid, but like they don't know it's stupid because they're teenagers and they haven't learned yet.
It is. It's just
really,
part of learning and growing, isn't it?
And it's, I think that's the thing, is they're not able to take risks and make mistakes. I could take risks, make mistakes, learn from them, and nobody was going to remember. Nowadays, that ability to take risks is really restricted. And I think thinking about parenting, one of the things that we look at, and one of the things that is kind of being questioned as well, is this idea that, as parents, do we allow our children to take risks? We're so desperate for them to succeed and do well that we don't let them fail. And actually, failure is a really important, failing in a very safe environment where, you can try it out, you can test the boundaries, you can learn, is really, really important. And we so often, we have kids that, will get to 18 and they've never failed anything, and suddenly they don't get the university of their choice. And it's like literally the whole world come tumbling down. And it's like, actually, you need it's like an immunity. You need to fail. You need to have that experience of failure to develop resilience, and you need to be able to fail in a safe environment. And there's just one of the things that I'm really keen for my students to do is to try and to get it wrong. And so quite often I'll set them up not to fail, but to not succeed brilliantly and not get 100%. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And you just touched on there, and again, I was reading something on your site when you were talking about the teenage brain. So, there's obviously lots of things that are changing in a teenager's brain at this moment in time, when they're going through and they've got all of this pressure. As parents, again, because I don't think we always think about that. So I've got 3 girls. My youngest is just turned 8. My eldest she's 15, and my middle one, she's going to be 13 in a couple of months' time. But I noticed so many changes in the 2 older girls, just forgetfulness, and just, sometimes I'll be talking to them about something and it's like they're listening, but they're not really listening. Do you know what I mean? They just seem to be all over the place. And a couple of other mums that I spoke to have said exactly the same thing. Oh, it's this teenage brain. What's going on within their head? And so anything we can do to sort of support them? Do you know what I mean?
No, I mean, this is all relatively new, and I think one of the things I suppose the teenage brain's got is a bit of bad press. So I want to kind of, as well, again, go back to those neuromyths, so to talk about some of the good things about the teenage brain. But essentially what happens is we have all of these like random connections that we've made as children. We've thousands, billions and billions of connections between neurons. And what happens is that we need to get rid of them because some of them are irrelevant. They're not helpful. And we just, we're not using them. So we need to get rid of them. I mean, like, this is a really random example. And I don't know why I think because I made the association so young and I made it so many times, but whenever I write the word porridge, I always think of the word library, because in the spelling test when I was probably 8, those were 2 words that I couldn't spell within that list. Now that probably has something to do with the emotion, but that's the sort of thing where, like, you don't need to remember the list itself. You just need to remember. So you prune away the actual list, right? So there are all these connections that you prune away, and that happens from the back of your brain, which is where your visual cortex is, all the way through the front of your brain. And your prefrontal cortex, if you put your hand on your forehead, that's the kind of that's your frontal lobe, and that's the bit that controls a lot of decision making, a lot of kind of what we call executive function. So it is like it's like the control center. It says, right, you can do this, that's a sensible thing, that's not a sensible thing. That happens last. That kind of bit is the bit that is developing really kind of towards this mid to late stages of kind of this big brain development. And during that time as well, you've got right in the center of your brain, deep in the center of your brain, you've got something called the limbic system, and that's your emotional regulation center. And so these two, usually in an adult, what's happening is your frontal lobe is going, right, okay, emotional brain, get control of yourself, sort yourself out, and then we'll make a rational decision about how we're going to deal with this problem. What teenagers do is they just go, they kind of almost bypass the frontal lobe and they just go to the emotional center. They're like, I love this, I'm going to do this really silly thing. And you totally makes sense, right? So if you go back in the evolutionary ages when we had to probably reproduce at a much younger age than we do now. So you need to separate from your family, you need to go away, you need to find new genetic material and find a partner. And so that's the point where you kind of know, as a teenager, you want to kind of go, I don't want anything to do with my parents, and I want to find new friends, and you become social. And it really affects their risk taking, and the risk taking is then mediated enormously by the peers. So horrible statistics like about car accidents with young men, much worse when you've got another person or 2 or 3 other people in the car. So and so that's the sort of thing where risk taking is mediated by peers at that young age, but also it allows for some really cool things. So teenagers are really creative and really flexible. They're not bound by like the adult constraints of like, oh well, you can't do that, because they're like, no, I can do anything. So that's brilliant, right? So they can be creative, they can be flexible, and we should sort of almost give them free rein. So as parents, I guess, thinking about that, it's about constructing those places to take risks safely. So they're going to take risks, right? So, and actually allowing them to take risks, not constraining them too much, but obviously giving them the sensible kind of options. So there's so much going on, and I think that the other thing that then happens as well is that they don't want to take risks in front of their peers if they're worried, because they feel sort of shame much more than we as adults do. And so if you're in a classroom and they're being picked on to do something in front of their peers, they'll feel enormous pressure and they don't want to take the risks. So again, that can be very constraining for them. And that's where you get that kind of social anxiety that we see a lot. So it's about kind of, it's finding that balance as a parent, about pushing them to take risks, but kind of giving the limit of the risks as well. So, and then also just recognizing that you are going to clash, because the way they make decisions is completely different from the way that we make decisions. We can see the big picture, the rationality of it, and they're just going with their emotions. They're just like, oh no, she really likes me, I'm going to do this, or he really hates me, I don't want to do that, So really not necessarily well thought out decision making, and we have to kind of accept that as well, and then talk through when I've always found, so my children are slightly older. I've got 21, 18, almost 19, and a 16-year-old, and I have found that actually when you're both in that really heightened emotional state, you absolutely have to step back and deal with the incident when you're both feeling calm and unemotional, just step away, because otherwise the teenager's never going to get away from that emotional bit. The minute their emotional center's triggered, you're going to struggle, aren't you?
Yes. Yes, yes, I completely hear what you're saying there. You also touch on the growth mindset and how
Yes.
important the growth mindset is, which I think you've just sort of underpinned with what you've said with regards to, trying and sort of, failing to learn how to move
Mm.
forward and that kind of thing. How do you sort of encourage your students or your own children with that growth mindset? Is there any other things that you do to help build it?
I think it's just about learning that it's okay to fail and
Mm,
having a go. For me, having a go is much more important than getting full marks. And I think, as a teacher, that's really, really important.
yes,
And then that reflection phase, so when things go wrong, right? And it's about when the emotion of the thing that's gone wrong has calmed, because
yeah,
again, you're not
yeah,
going to get anything out when everyone's emotional. So a
yeah,
couple of days later, sitting back and having that conversation about, okay, well, what did go wrong? What should we as parents have done to help you?
yeah, yeah,
What could you have done differently? How
yeah,
would you approach it next time? And I think it's that reflection. I think, going back to the start of the conversation when we were talking about myths, one of the problems is with growth mindset is there's a kind of a lot of, you can't do it yet. It's that idea of I can't do it
yeah,
yet. Well,
yeah,
there are some things, like it doesn't matter how much I practice, I'm never going to be able to be a
yes,
good tennis player.
yes,
It's not going to happen, right? So there comes a point where I can practice and I can definitely get better, but I
mm,
am not going to win Wimbledon any day
no,
soon.
yeah,
How, even if I'd
yeah,
started at like knee high to a
yeah,
grasshopper, I would never be a Wimbledon tennis player.
yeah,
And so I think it's about helping them to find the things that they're good at, the things that they're nurturing that, but also
yeah,
accepting that there are going to be setbacks, allowing those setbacks, because when you and we're all fixed mindset about something. So I'm probably very fixed mindset about my tennis playing abilities,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
I sort of know I can get better at playing tennis if I put
yeah,
more effort in, but the effort for me is outweighs the the pleasure of playing.
yeah,
um but I think that it's that idea of like managing failure, coping it, and seeing it as an opportunity to grow and an
yeah,
opportunity to learn. And therefore, it is okay to take risks and have a go and try and think about, the fact that, your brain. Sorry, I'm sorry, I've got a dog barking in the
that's
background.
all right. Don't
Um,
worry.
I think the brain is the most amazing organ in that it is incredibly plastic. It grows neurons really, really quickly. Even, I'm quite a lot older, and I'm now got to the point where I'm in cognitive decline, which is really sad. But even so, I can still grow like these new neural connections, and
Mm,
teenagers' brains are growing them left, right, and center. So we've
yeah,
really, and those kind of attitudes, I suppose, are really important to ingrain, because actually, if you're going into new jobs where you've got to learn stuff, if you're thinking, well, I can't learn how to do that for whatever reason, you're going to restrict the job opportunities, what you think you can do, what you think you can achieve. So
mm,
I think the growth mindset is, I mean, in some ways, I like thinking of it more as like a failure mindset, and thinking about, well, some people look at the failure and they go, I'm a failure. It's, I failed at that, I am a failure,
yeah,
rather than kind of,
yeah,
I failed at that, what can I learn? And that
yeah,
reflection and that reflective process is really important. And I think as parents, that's where we can really come in and help. We can really think about, okay, that you and like we do, right? You screwed that up,
yes,
right? What are
yes.
we going to learn for next time?
Yeah, I love that. I say to my girls, one of the best beliefs you can have is that you can always grow and get better. Do you know what I mean? It might not
Yeah.
work out the first time around, but you can try again and you can try again if you're willing just to keep, like you mentioned, keep trying. And actually, what you just said there's like a lesson for us adults as well, isn't it? Because I think even as an adult, there's sometimes we try things and we get it wrong. And then we see ourselves as, oh God, I'm no good at that. I'm not good enough. It's that, oh, I'm not good enough. But
Mm.
actually, we can get better at most things if we just put the effort in. So,
Yeah, and I think I always sort of say to my kids, it's not what you do when you screw up, it's how you deal with it afterwards that
yeah,
shows who you are as a person.
yeah,
And I had this conversation because my son
how to
had
get back
done
up.
something really stupid, as they
Yeah,
do, and I said, look, I'm a rubbish parent, and he
yeah,
just looked at me and he was like, no, you're not. I said, I screw up all the time, but I would always want to apologize when I screw up, and I hopefully I get it right the next time round.
yeah,
But if you don't accept that if you can't accept that you've got it wrong, or like defend it, then you're never going to learn. So I think
yeah,
that's it's it's not the incident itself, it's the way you deal with it afterwards that's really important, and as I say, shows that character more.
Definitely. I noticed, I don't know if it was on one of your podcasts or not, but you were talking about ways to improve well-being in the home. And I would imagine, I don't know if it was 10 ways to improve well-being in the home.
Probably.
When you're talking about well-being, you're talking about mental, emotional well-being.
Yes, psychological well-being as opposed to, I mean, physical well-being. Quite often they're interlinked, right? So if you're physically well, then you're emotionally well as well. So again, you know, taking your exercise, eating healthily is all going to help. So yeah,
getting out in nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, but again, it's horses for courses. So we all like different things, and there's an element of what works for you as an individual, and actually what works for you as an adult might not be the same thing that works for your kids. And what works for them as kids might not be what works for them when they're older. And so all of these things change over time, but it's about kind of, I always think about it's like encouraging the good habits, because the habits that we embed and we encourage in them, we model ourselves are what is important. You know, it's what the kids are going to see, right? So you need to be doing the things that you're telling your kids to do. If you're telling your kids to exercise and eat healthily, you've got to do it as well as a parent.
No, I totally hear you saying that. So you obviously you're in schools, you're supporting parents as well. I know you do some one-on-ones, do you, with parents if their children are struggling?
To be honest, not so much anymore, because I just don't have time. But there are lots of, as I say, the podcast is really out there. I used to do that more, but it's just time.
Okay, so it's in school. So if people want to reach out to you and learn from you or hear about, you know, how they can support their teenagers with regards to sort of bringing psychology into their everyday lives, is it best for them to get onto the podcast and hear what you're saying there?
Yeah, that for the moment is the best. I mean, I'm hopefully in the process of writing a book that will maybe that might come out, but we'll see. That's a long way off.
Okay.
And I say that, you know, optimistically. I'm always saying that, and I've yet to actually publish a book, but we'll get there.
No, it sounds amazing. So I just think, just summing up everything that we've spoke about, it really comes down to sort of, I say failing forward, but just accepting, you know, that we're not going to get everything right all of the time. Trying to help our teenagers, our children, build that growth mindset, in the sense, or that failure mindset, where they're like, okay, if I get it wrong, that's okay. I can do it better the next time round. You touched about the illusion of fluency. Have I said that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah. And how about trying to extract that information back out of their brains, rather than it just being reading it over and over and over again. I think that's, you've given us some real sort of insightful, you know, tips and things that teenagers, that children can do to sort of support their emotional, mental wellness, which is what we're all about, really. Is there anything you want to leave us with that you're thinking, oh, I haven't covered that, and I think that would be really beneficial?
I think if I started on that, we'd never get out. So probably,
No.
I think we've covered an enormous amount just in the kind of the few minutes that we've been talking. But yeah, so probably not for the time being. But as I say, there's loads on the podcast. So, and if you go to the website, it's sort of divided up into sections. So if you're interested about like how you can improve your study skills to help with mental health, there's a bit about learning. And if you want to know about mental health and well-being, if you want to know about learn more about SEND, then you can go into the SEND section. So it's all divided up into sections. So it should be fairly easy to kind of access and work out where to go.
That is fantastic. Well, Lucinda, thank you so much for your time today. It was lovely to speak to you. And I will put all of your contact details on the YouTube, and I'll also pop them onto the podcast. So people want to reach out to you, they can. If they've got any questions, are you happy for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, there's a contact form on my website, so you can do it through that. But thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk about psychology.
No, it's lovely. Thank you again, and we will look forward to catching up with you soon.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Lucinda. Take care. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to learn more about M.Y.T.E, our M.Y.T.E program and its profound toolkit, jump over to our website and get in touch with us. We are here to support you and the children in your care.